know what I was expecting, if anything, and it turned out to be a very interesting, very good study. And so, to give kind of an introduction to the book, during the reign of Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, the king of Persia, a plot was developed that threatened to wipe out the entire Jewish people. It began when a Jew named Mordecai refused to bow to Haman, the king's second in command. Haman was full of pride and fury and didn't just want to kill Mordecai, but the entire Jewish people. And so with the king's seal, he sent out a decree that on a single day, all Jews, men, women, and children, were to be slaughtered. And that's Esther chapter 3, verse 13. A young woman named Esther, who was orphaned and raised by Mordecai, her cousin, was unexpectedly crowned Queen of Persia. For a time, her Jewish heritage remained a secret, but Mordecai challenges Esther. Perhaps she came to royalty for such a time as this. Esther 4:14. And so, risking her own life, she revealed her Jewish identity and used her influence with the king to expose Haman's wicked plot to destroy Israel. And then Haman is brought to justice. The Jews avoid extinction, and God's providence rings throughout Israel. In short, that is the book of Esther. And so I hope to give an overview and maybe go just a little bit more in depth. Unfortunately, we can't go too deep into it. But just to start out, I'll go by giving some facts about the book of Esther before we get into the material itself. Esther was a Jew who was favored in a foreign land. And that's not a new concept to us if we study the Old Testament. In Genesis 41, the story of Joseph, despite numerous hardships that Joseph experienced, he was sold into slavery, he was imprisoned, he was forgotten by countless people, including his brothers, his friends, people that he met in prison. Despite all those things, he found favor in the sight of Pharaoh, who placed him second in command over all of Egypt. In Exodus 2, we have the story of Moses, where after being found in the Nile River by Pharaoh's daughter, was raised as Pharaoh's son. He was raised as a prince of Egypt. I'd say he found favor there. And then after killing an Egyptian and fearing what they would do to him, he fled to the land of Midian, where he also found favor in that land. Throughout the book of Daniel, Daniel found favor with Babylon, and although he found himself in the king's crosshairs, in trouble with Babylon a few times, he ultimately found favor with King Nebuchadnezzar, and Israel prospered. And there are other examples, among which is Esther, who found favor with the king of Persia during a time when the Jews were going to be obliterated, and that favor saved her people. It saved God's people. Another fact, Esther, along with Solomon, Ruth, and Song of Solomon, Ruth, and Ecclesiastes and Lamentations were all compiled together in a scroll, and that scroll was used in festival readings. And I think you'll be able to understand why Esther is used in festival readings once we've taken a chance to look at the events in this book. And a hint is that the events of Esther are the reason for the festival Purim, and we'll actually see that being established later on. And that is a holiday that the Jewish people still celebrate today. So if you aren't familiar, which you probably are, Haman is the big bad guy that we'll talk about a little bit. Just as a fun fact about this festival, one of the traditions in this holiday is anytime someone mentions the name Purim, everyone who hears it shouts as loud as they can, trying to compete to see who can shout boo the loudest. They boo at the name of Haman, and so it's an interesting festival that's come of it. Some more things. Esther is one of 2 books in the Bible that's named after women. It is one of 7 Old Testament books that's not quoted word for word in the New Testament, but rest assured it still passes all the tests of inspiration. There are a couple more, but the one that I really want to pause on for a little bit is that God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but his presence is not questioned. I want you to remember that. We don't have time to read this entire book in class, but I want to challenge you to find some time to go through and to read this book in one sitting and tell me that you don't see God's presence and providence all throughout. Scholar Matthew Henry noted, if the name of God is not in the book, his finger is. And I think that perfectly sums it up. And then one more thing to note on this idea. I don't know if it's something that we can definitely conclude is intentional, but certainly a possibility is that Hebrew scholars have noted that the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh, YHWH, is found in acrostic form, which is a Hebrew literary device. It's found 4 times at crucial points in the book. That's Esther 1:20, 5:4, 5:13, and 7:7. And so I am no Hebrew scholar. I can't read Hebrew. I wouldn't even know where to begin to start. And so you can take that or discard it. But it's just interesting to know that even though God's name is not plastered throughout the book, there's no doubt that God definitely had a hand in the events of the book of Esther. The author of Esther is debated. Some say that it was Ezra, making connections to the time period and writing style, while others say it was Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who wrote it, since he would have had access to the records of the Persian courts after rising to be second in command later on in this book. But regardless, ultimately, who do we know is the author of the book of Esther? The Holy Spirit, God. Esther was written about 465 to 460 BC or later, and it takes place between Ezra, chapter 6 and 7, right in the middle there, approximately 54 years after the return from the first Israelite captivity under Babylon, and it covers about 20 years. So that's interesting to note. We're going to be going through a lot of things very quickly. 10 chapters, cover the entire book in, 40, 30 minutes. And so it's going to seem like we're going really fast, but it's important to take a step back and to realize these things aren't unfolding as quickly as we're going through them right now. It's taking place over 20 years. Final thing that I would point out is the purpose of the book of Esther. I believe that there are 2 main purposes for the book of Esther, and if you have something different to add, then I'd like to hear. But in looking at the big picture of the Bible, which is the redemption of mankind through the Messiah, that really encapsulates the whole idea of Scripture. The first purpose is to show that Christ's seed line is protected and traced through this period. Now, the Holy Spirit could have said Christ's seed line was preserved through the reign of Ahasuerus and left it at that, if that's what he wanted to say. But there's more to this book. Esther is not simply a history lesson or a ladies' Bible class book. It's a book that shows a part of God that can be as encouraging to Christians today as it was to the Hebrews who were living this out at the time and experiencing these things. And so the second purpose of Esther, I would say, is to remind readers of God's providence and to encourage readers to restore their trust in that providence. This book should be read with tremendous suspense as the great narrative of the Bible hangs in the balance. What you see here is what you see in Esther, is a terrified nation of Israel, but a faithful one, which is something that we don't always see when Israel experiences hardships. But because of Israel's faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to his promise to protect Israel and to preserve that line of Christ, Israel is kept safe from a very serious plot to wipe the nation out. And so let me refer you back to the Matthew Henry quote, "If God's name is not in this book, his finger is." So Esther ultimately is a book about God's providence. The key verse in the book of Esther chapter 4, verses 13 through 16 is that block of scripture. It's kind of the heart of the book, showing God's providence to place Esther, the representative of her people, in the presence of the one man powerful enough to reverse the extinction of Israel and to protect the line of Christ. And so, if someone would please read for me Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and through 16. And I want you to especially place emphasis on verse 14 there.
Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Shusha, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther ordered him.
Thank you very much for reading that. And if you want to choose out a single verse that really encapsulates what this book is all about, it's that second part of verse 14. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows if God has placed you right here for a purpose? It really does show God's providence. And also just special emphasis on that last part in verse 16, where Esther shows that zeal to do what she's been asked, to go to the king, which is against the law and could have resulted in her death. Yet what does she say? If I perish, I perish. So with that said, we're going to get into the outline of the book of Esther. This will take up the rest of our class time. We're just going to go chapter by chapter and just give a brief overview of the events that are going on, and we'll try and hone in on some of the verses as we go through as well. Chapter 1, we're going to call it the stage, and I usually have a PowerPoint for this, and it shows that someone else did the outline, so I did get as far as the chapter 1 is titled, The Stage, chapter 2 is this and that. I did get that from someone else, so fair credit where that is due. But chapter 1 is the stage, and it sets the stage for the book of Esther. We're first introduced to Ahasuerus, like I said, also known as Xerxes, the king of Persia, who ruled over 127 provinces. This is a powerful man. Ahasuerus hosts a banquet for his nobles, his princes, and all the military leaders in his kingdom. A celebration, talk about a party, that lasts 180 days. So from Greek history, though not mentioned in the text, I do want to make that clear, we know that not long after this banquet, Ahasuerus went to war with Greece, and some have suggested that it's possible that part of this 180-day banquet was spent strategizing for the war, but I don't think we should read too far into that. Unfortunately for Ahasuerus, the battle didn't go well for him, and so, in fact, it nearly resulted in his annihilation. And so some have suggested that he may have returned home to find a new queen to console in after his loss. And so that said, we're jumping ahead, and that's all speculation anyway, so take it or leave it. But following this 180-day banquet, the king threw another celebration lasting 7 days, and he went all out. There are expensive decorations, silver rings, marble columns, couches of gold and silver. There's mosaics and golden goblets. I mean, he's going all out. On the third day, the final day of this celebration, Ahasuerus wanted to show off the beauty of his wife, Queen Vashti, and all of her majesty to all the people and provinces. There was a problem. What happened? Did Vashti want to go along with that? And she refused. And so enraged and humiliated, Ahasuerus sought counsel from his wise men, who advised him that this disobedient behavior could catch on, encouraging other wives to rebel also. And so to deter this behavior, or at least to attempt to, Ahasuerus banished Vashti from his presence and revoked her title as queen. And then he sent out a decree that every man should be the master of his own house. And so that kind of sets the stage, because guess what Ahasuerus doesn't have anymore? He doesn't have a queen, and so that's going to be an important part of the book. Chapter 2 is the selection. Now that the stage is set, it deals with the selection of a new queen. And so with his queen gone and likely having suffered a tremendous loss to Greece, Ahasuerus now seeks to replace Vashti. And so he sends for beautiful women, and he gives them cosmetics to see which one would please him the most. And here's where we're introduced to two key characters, Mordecai and his younger cousin, whom he raised as his own daughter, Esther. Esther is described as being beautiful in form and face, and upon noticing her beauty, Ahasuerus quickly, the Bible notes, gave her food, cosmetics, 7 of his best maids, and the best room in his harem. Then notice this detail in verse 10. Esther had not made known her people or kindred. This is chapter 2, verse 10. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. I'll probably mention this again, but Esther, there are so many little details that you may just discard initially, but they're ultimately building to one point. It's such a beautiful, well done, organized story, and you see these seemingly random details that are going to be very important later on, and so this is definitely one of them. Ahasuerus didn't know that she was a Jew. And that's going to be important to the rest of the book, especially in the next chapter. And so for 12 months, Esther lived in the king's harem, where the young women basically made themselves attractive as they could to the king. And when they appeared before the king in this way, he would give them whatever they desired from his palace. But Esther, on the other hand, didn't ask for much. So before long, she began winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, but especially the king. The king took notice of her beauty, took notice of her behavior, and so loving her more than all the other women, Ahasuerus made Esther the queen in Vashti's place. So while all this is going on, though, like I said, we're building up this story. We're given a couple hints suggesting Esther is still in communication with Mordecai, who is advising her on what to do or what not to do. And so that's going to be extremely important, especially in chapter 4, where a pivotal conversation takes place between the two. But before the chapter ends, Mordecai overhears a plot of the king's officials to kill the king. And so he reports this plot to Esther, who then warns Ahasuerus on Mordecai's behalf. And the plot was investigated and found to be true, and so the guilty were hanged. And Mordecai had effectively saved King Ahasuerus. And so already you see these little details that may seem out of place, but they are vitally important to this story, and we're building to a climax. Chapter 3 is the scheme. It introduces yet another character, Haman. And Haman is established as the king's second in command over all the provinces. And to honor him, the king commanded his servants to bow down to Haman. This is going to be a very important event because everyone bowed down that we know of except for Mordecai. Now, it's interesting to note the Bible isn't very clear on why he didn't bow down. It does note that he was a Jew, but it doesn't say anything more than that, really. And so there's kind of two ideas that people try to interpret this as. Number one is that maybe Mordecai was just a prideful man. Maybe he just didn't respect Haman, and so maybe he was being spiteful when he didn't bow down. I don't tend to think that's the case. You can disagree with me, but it's my understanding, especially when we look at things like Daniel and his friends who refused to bow down before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar made. It's probable that he didn't bow down because this may have been some form of worship to Haman. At least that could have been perceived that way. And so it's at least possible that Mordecai was refusing to bow down because this would have been worshiping someone other than the true God. But regardless of his intent, this enraged Haman was enraged and full of hurt pride, and he sought to destroy all of the Jews just for this one man's act. And so this wicked scheme that Haman develops is the major conflict in the book of Esther. And so this is a little bit longer, but if someone would read Esther chapter 3, verses 5 through 11.
they cast her, that is the lot, before Haman, from day to day, and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. And their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, and to bring it into the king's treasuries. And to 11?
Yes, to 11.
And the king took off his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee.
All right, I apologize. There's some fun names in there, but the entire nation of Israel now faces total extinction because of the childish anger and pride of Haman, the Bible notes enemy of the Jews. Where is God? That's probably the question right now. How will Israel be saved, and how will the line of Christ be preserved? And so that's why chapter 4 is the search. With the news that a day had been selected for their people to be destroyed, the Jews understandably began weeping loudly and publicly. And so you have to assume that they were likely wondering where their deliverer is going to come from. This is not the first time that Israel has been afflicted by another nation. In fact, it's not the first time other nations have sought to destroy them completely. But in every case so far, God has sent a deliverer to save Israel. So you can imagine that as they fasted and wore sackcloth and ashes, mourning their pending extinction, Israel had to be wondering, searching for their next deliverer. And so what follows is a dialogue relayed by one of the king's eunuchs between Esther and Mordecai. And that's kind of getting to that key verse that we were talking about earlier. Esther, obviously distressed, asks why Haman is doing all of this. And so Mordecai explains what happened, why Haman wants to destroy the Jews, and how he got King Ahasuerus on board with this plan. And then he begs Esther to go and plead on behalf of her people. Well, Esther, fearing what the king might do to her, explained that anyone who went into his presence without being summoned was to be put to death unless the king pardoned them. And she added the king had not summoned her in 30 days. And so Esther, you see her fearing for her life. And that's when we see those key verses come into play, that pivotal point in the book of Esther. Mordecai responds to Esther, telling her that her Jewish identity may not be known yet, but it will eventually come to light, and she won't escape the fate of the rest of the Jews. He then adds that the Jews may find salvation in another place, which I believe is another nod towards the providence of God, that even if this deliverer is not going to come through Esther, someone else is going to come along because God is going to keep his promise to preserve them. But that said, he adds that while the Jews may find salvation in another place, she will perish, ending her father's lineage. In his final attempt to persuade Esther to talk to the king, Mordecai says those famous words, "Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Who knows if God, in his careful providence, knew that there would be a plot to destroy the Jews, and he is using you to save his people. And then Esther responds, "I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I die, so be it." What bravery from the young Queen Esther. What providence from God to give her an audience with the only man powerful enough to reverse Israel's extinction. Chapter 5 is the suspense. It opens with Esther going before the king. Upon entering his house and standing before his throne, Esther found favor in his sight. And so the king was not angry with Esther to the point of killing her. In fact, he stuck out his scepter for her to touch as a sign she has been pardoned for her entrance. And then he asks Esther what she requested and that it would be granted to her up to half of the kingdom. Already, Esther has avoided death. That's a good sign so far. But I get the feeling she doesn't want to push it by placing all of this on him on the spot. There's still a matter that she is a Jew, and Ahasuerus has agreed to a plot to kill the Jews. And so rather than immediately requesting Haman's plot be reversed, she instead asks for the king's and for Haman's response at a banquet which she would prepare just for them. And Ahasuerus agrees to this. And so for the rest of this chapter, you see this suspense where no harm is done to Esther or Haman, but we're getting closer and closer to the big showdown. And then to end chapter 5, just another one of those kind of end of the chapter. We need to note this. It's important for the plot. Haman passed by Mordecai and Saul. Despite this plot against the Jews, Mordecai still didn't show any signs of fear for Haman. There was no fear, there was no respect, nothing. And so this only enraged him more, to the point Haman went out and he had gallows built to hang Mordecai on. And so keep that detail in mind. Chapter 6 is the shift. As we read through this story in just a few short minutes, it's easy to forget that a lot of time has passed between these events. And so chapter 6 opens with Ahasuerus realizing nothing was done to honor Mordecai for saving his life back in chapter 2. And so he seeks to correct that, to reward Mordecai. Well, about the time this dawned on him, Haman entered his court, and get this, he was getting ready to request that Mordecai be hanged on the gallows he had just made. You remember when I said this was a fun study? There were times throughout the book where I laughed at what was going on. It was amusing, right? And this is one of those points. Before he could request this, before Haman could request that Mordecai be killed, the king presents Haman with a question. What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman's thinking, he's talking about me. Esther 6, verses 7 through 9. Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought on which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on his head. And then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, and then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. You know what King Ahasuerus says? Everything you just said, go do that for Mordecai. Mordecai has refused to bow to Haman. He has yet to show any sign of fear or respect, and now Haman is made to publicly honor him. In fact, since this is how Haman described being honored, this is the greatest thing in Haman's mind he thinks could possibly happen to someone, to be honored by him. And now he has to do that for the person he despises the most. And so he's humiliated, he's furious, his ego has taken some major hits. So you see this shift in the narrative from the Jews being afraid of Haman to Haman being forced to honor the Jew who stirred his anger in the first place. And then chapter 6 ends with Haman being reminded of the banquet that's been prepared. And I can't help but wonder if maybe he thought, hey, I've had a really bad day. Maybe something good will come of this. Spoiler, it doesn't. Chapter 7 is the switch. Deals with Esther's banquet. Right away, Ahasuerus asks what Esther's request is, again promising her anything up to half of his kingdom. And so she makes an appeal saying, verses 3 and 4 of chapter 7, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Spare me and my people, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Keep in mind what Ahasuerus still doesn't know. He still doesn't know she's a Jew. And so he's unaware of who our people are and who it is that's trying to destroy them. And he inquires as to who would do this to them. Esther responds saying, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman, the person who is sitting at this very table." So the truth is out there. Esther has claimed the Jews as her people and revealed Haman's true intentions. This entire story, Esther becoming queen, Haman's revenge on Mordecai and the Jews, the scheming and plotting and conflict all throughout, all of these have led to this point. Now the ball's in the king's court. What will he do? So King Ahasuerus becomes furious with Haman. And then as they were binding him up in this just ironic twist, one of the king's eunuchs pointed to the gallows Haman had made for Mordecai, who the Bible notes as Mordecai had done good to the king. And so the king declared, "Hang Haman on it." So with his ironic switch, Haman was hanged on the very gallows he crafted to exact his childish revenge on Mordecai. But that left one problem, which 8 will deal with, chapter 8, the statute. Chapter 8 follows this drama with Esther begging the king to reverse Haman's orders to kill the Jews. Haman has been brought to justice, and Esther, though revealing herself to be a Jew, still has favor in the king's sight. And so already there is some relief. Like I said, as we're going throughout this story, you might even see it as this narrative or this play or this movie almost as we're reading it. And there's this suspense all throughout as everything is building up. You don't know, are they going to be saved? Are the Jews going to be saved? Is Queen Esther going to be pardoned? What's going to happen? And so you have this immediate relief because Haman, the wicked man, has been put to death. And Esther, though being found to be a Jew, has found favor. But the fate of the Jews still hangs in the balance. Now, I don't have it written. I had to jot it down on the margins of my notes. This isn't something that I believe the Bible explains, but historians have noted that Persian law prevents even a king from reversing a law or a decree, which is going to make sense. Because although Ahasuerus didn't reverse Haman's decree, he did allow them to write their own statute that the Jews could defend themselves from the attack, and he gave them his signet ring so that all the kingdom would know he approved of their defense. And so the statute was written and distributed to all the Jews in the land. But I want you to notice this contrast from chapter 4, where Israel is mourning and weeping and wailing, to now they are celebrating. They're not out of the waters yet. They still have this fight that's coming their way, but they're allowed to fight back. And so they're celebrating this. Esther chapter 8, verses 16 and 17, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city where the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Chapter 9 is titled The Salvation. Sure enough, notice how it opens. In verse 1, on the day that the enemy of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, get this, the opposite occurred. Is that what it says in your translation? What does that say there? Does it say the opposite occurred? Quite the opposite happened. In that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. 75,000 of their enemies were killed, including the 10 sons of Haman. I will go ahead and note here, what does this tell us about the surrounding nations? It tells us they didn't like the Jews. They had problems with the Jews, and this decree was merely just, a chance to legally, just unleash their wrath on the nation of Israel. And so it's interesting to note also, just yet another thing contributing to this idea of God's providence, that the Jews were in a place surrounded by people that hated them, that wanted to kill them, and this was their opportunity. Yet 75,000 of their enemies were killed, including the 10 sons of Haman, who were all ironically hanged as well. For every victory, you see this reoccurring phrase, they did not lay a hand on the plunder. I should have written down how many times this occurs. It's more than once. But the point is, the Jews didn't want this battle. The Jews didn't want riches. That's not what it's about. They just wanted salvation, and salvation came. And so in celebration of their victory, the festival Purim was formed so that their generation and the ones to follow would remember this great deliverance. Chapter 10, then, is the success. It's a very short, and it just sheds light on the continued success of Mordecai. Already, you see this major success as Haman has been brought to justice. Esther has been pardoned by the king despite concealing her identity. The Jews were able to defend themselves, and then the time came where they were attacked, and they were actually triumphant, right? They have saved themselves, and yet it doesn't stop there. Not only are they back where they were before, you have this idea of the continued success of Mordecai. And I think the idea is to show that not only did Israel survive near destruction, but they were greatly blessed. Mordecai not only escaped Haman's wrath, but he also replaced him, becoming the king's second in command. And so from that idea, we have this, assurance that with a Jew being so high up, maybe that official would be able to continue to do good and to bless his people, maybe have a little bit more say, give Israel a voice. And so we see this just continued success, right? Not only are they delivered, they prosper. So to conclude, if you saw anything but God's providence throughout the book of Esther, I think you've missed the point. God's name may not be mentioned, but it is certainly a tribute to his protective care and constant provision for his people, even when all hope seems lost. Esther is so much more than we often make it out to be. Whether a kid's story, a lady's Bible class book, it's more than that, even though that's what it's often reduced to. It's a beautiful story about a young woman's bravery, a faithful nation in the threat of extinction, and God's providence to lead his people to safety no matter how bad things have gotten. I think that story is certainly an effective one today. There has been we've lived through a lot of history in the last few years. It seems like there's so many senseless acts of violence, and you can try and pin it on a group if you want. The reality is, Christians know it's a result of evil. It's a result of living in a sinful, fallen, broken humanity. And so there are times when evil seems to be triumphant, when it seems to prevail. All hope seems to be lost as Christians are the minority, and it seems like just the world around them is, oppressing them, and they're going to destroy them. How are we going to survive? Guess what? God is still here. God is still everywhere around us. His hand is in our lives. He is still writing our stories. This isn't our end. And so I hope that you can take comfort from this and just learn a story about God's providence no matter what's going on. So I very much appreciate you for this time and for attention. I think we have a 15-minute break. Thank you.
Yep.